Background of the case. In the quiet, unassuming town of Millfield, Ohio, a place where everyone seemed to know each other and life moved at a slow, predictable pace, a horrifying secret lay hidden beneath the surface. The year was 2018, and the town, with its tree-lined streets, modest homes, and a population of just over 12,000, was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and waved to strangers passing by. It was the last place anyone would expect to uncover one of the most chilling crimes in recent American history. The story began to unravel on a cold November evening when a frantic 911 call came into the Millfield Police Department. The voice on the other end of the line was shaky, barely audible, and filled with terror. "Please help me, I escaped, there are others still trapped," the young woman whispered, her words broken by sobs. The dispatcher, initially thinking it might be a prank or a misunderstanding, pressed for more details. But as the woman described the horrors she had endured and the location of the house she had fled from, the dispatcher realized this was no ordinary call. Within minutes, officers were dispatched to the address she provided, a modest, single-story home on the outskirts of town, owned by a man named David Carter. David Carter was, by all accounts, an ordinary man. A 38-year-old former construction worker, he had lived in Millfield for most of his life. Neighbors described him as quiet, polite, and somewhat of a loner. He was the kind of man who kept to himself but would occasionally wave to his neighbors while mowing his lawn or taking out the trash. No one suspected that beneath his seemingly normal exterior lay a deeply disturbed individual capable of unimaginable cruelty. The house itself was unremarkable, a small, weathered structure with peeling white paint and a neatly trimmed yard. But what lay beneath it was anything but ordinary. Hidden under the floorboards of the house was a secret that David had spent years constructing, a reinforced underground bunker complete with steel doors, soundproof walls, and a labyrinth of narrow passageways. It was a place designed not just to imprison, but to break the spirits of those who were unfortunate enough to find themselves trapped there. For years, women had been disappearing from nearby towns and cities, women who were often overlooked by society. Many were homeless, struggling with addiction, or estranged from their families. Their disappearances were rarely reported, and when they were, the cases often went cold due to a lack of leads. No one connected the dots, and no one suspected that the quiet town of Millfield could be the epicenter of such a sinister operation. David Carter had carefully chosen his victims, targeting those who were vulnerable and unlikely to be missed. He would frequent homeless shelters, soup kitchens, and bus stations in nearby cities, offering help to women in desperate situations. He presented himself as a kind and trustworthy man, someone who wanted to give them a fresh start, a job, a place to stay, and a chance to rebuild their lives. But once they stepped into his home, their lives would change forever. The young woman who made the 911 call, later identified as 24-year-old Sarah Johnson, had been one of David's captives for nearly 6 months. She had been lured in with promises of a job and a safe place to stay, only to find herself locked in a dark, airless room beneath the house. She described the conditions as hell on earth, a place where the air was thick with the stench of mold and decay, where the only light came from a single flickering bulb, and where the screams of other captives echoed through the walls. Sarah's escape was nothing short of miraculous. She had managed to pry open a small ventilation grate in the bunker, crawling through a narrow, filthy duct that led to the outside world. Bruised, starving, and terrified, she ran barefoot through the woods until she reached a gas station, where she borrowed a phone to call for help. Her courage and determination would ultimately lead to the discovery of David Carter's horrifying crimes and the rescue of 3 other women who were still trapped in the bunker. When police arrived at the house, they were met with an eerie silence. The front door was locked and there were no signs of life inside. But as they began to search the property, they noticed something unusual, a heavy steel hatch hidden beneath a rug in the living room. It took several officers to pry it open, revealing a steep staircase that descended into darkness. What they found at the bottom of those stairs would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The discovery of the bunker and the conditions inside shocked even the most seasoned investigators. The walls were lined with chains and restraints, and the air was thick with the smell of human suffering. There were makeshift beds, buckets used as toilets, and evidence of physical and psychological torture. The women who were rescued were malnourished, traumatized, and barely able to speak. But their survival was a testament to their strength and resilience in the face of unimaginable horror. As news of the case spread, the town of Millfield was thrust into the national spotlight. Reporters and camera crews descended on the quiet community, turning it into a media circus. Neighbors who had once thought of David Carter as a harmless recluse were now grappling with the reality that they had been living next to a monster. The case raised troubling questions about how such atrocities could go unnoticed for so long, and how someone like David Carter could hide his true nature behind a mask of normalcy. The story of the Millfield bunker would go on to become one of the most infamous criminal cases in American history, a chilling reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most ordinary places. It was a case that would leave a lasting scar on the town, and a profound impact on everyone involved, from the survivors to the investigators who worked tirelessly to bring David Carter to justice. The villain and his meticulous plan. David Carter, the man at the center of the Millfield bunker case, was not the kind of person anyone would have suspected of harboring such dark and twisted intentions. On the surface, he was the picture of normalcy, a 38-year-old former construction worker who lived alone in a modest house on the outskirts of town. He was quiet, polite, and largely kept to himself. Neighbors described him as the kind of guy you'd barely notice, someone who blended into the background of small-town life. But beneath this unassuming exterior lay a deeply disturbed individual who had spent years meticulously planning one of the most horrifying crimes in recent American history. David's descent into darkness didn't happen overnight. Investigators would later uncover that his obsession with control and domination had been building for years, fueled by a combination of personal failures, isolation, and a growing fascination with the macabre. After losing his job as a construction foreman in 2014 due to budget cuts, David's life began to spiral. He struggled to find steady work, and his social circle dwindled to almost nothing. He spent most of his days alone in his house, browsing the internet and consuming disturbing content that seemed to feed his darker impulses. It was during this period of isolation that David began to formulate his plan. Using his background in construction, he decided to build a secret bunker beneath his home, a place where he could exert absolute control over others, free from the scrutiny of the outside world. The idea wasn't just about creating a physical space, it was about constructing a world where he was the sole authority, where his word was law, and where his victims would have no choice but to submit to his will. The construction of the bunker was a feat of engineering that spoke to David's skill and determination. Over the course of 2 years he worked tirelessly to dig out the space beneath his house, often working late at night to avoid drawing attention. He reinforced the walls with concrete and installed steel doors that could only be opened with a custom-made key. The bunker was soundproofed to ensure that no noise would escape, and he installed a ventilation system to keep the air circulating. Every detail was carefully thought out, from the placement of the lights to the hidden cameras he used to monitor his captives. But David's plan didn't stop at the physical construction of the bunker. He also spent months researching how to manipulate and control his victims. He read books on psychology and coercion, studied cases of other criminals who had successfully kept captives for long periods, and even practiced his recruitment techniques by approaching women in public places. He knew that his victims would need to be carefully chosen, women who were vulnerable, isolated, and unlikely to be missed. He targeted homeless shelters, bus stations, and low-income neighborhoods, places where desperation often overshadowed caution. David's approach was calculated and methodical. He would present himself as a kind and trustworthy man, offering help to women who were down on their luck. He would promise them a job, a place to stay, or even just a warm meal and a safe place to sleep for the night. His demeanor was disarming, soft-spoken, polite, and seemingly genuine. Many of his victims later said that they had no reason to suspect anything was wrong until it was too late. Once he had lured a victim to his home, David's true nature would reveal itself. The moment they stepped inside, the door would lock behind them, and the nightmare would begin. He would lead them to the living room, where he had hidden the entrance to the bunker beneath a rug. Using a combination of threats and physical force, he would force them down the steep staircase into the darkness below. From that moment on, they were completely at his mercy. Inside the bunker, David's control was absolute. He had designed the space to break his victims both physically and psychologically. The rooms were small and cramped, with barely enough space to move. The air was thick and stale, and the only light came from dim, flickering bulbs. He used chains and restraints to keep his captives in place, and he controlled every aspect of their lives, from when they ate to when they slept. He would alternate between acts of kindness, offering food or a blanket, and acts of cruelty, creating a cycle of hope and despair that left his victims completely dependent on him. David's meticulous planning extended to how he managed the outside world. He was careful to maintain the appearance of a normal life, going about his daily routine as if nothing was amiss. He paid his bills on time, kept his yard tidy, and even attended community events on occasion. He knew that the key to avoiding suspicion was to blend in, and he did so masterfully. Even his internet activity was carefully curated. He used encrypted browsers and deleted his search history regularly to avoid leaving a digital trail. What made David's plan so chilling was not just its complexity but its purpose. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a calculated, premeditated act of evil, designed to give him complete control over the lives of others. He didn't just want to imprison his victims, he wanted to break them, to strip away their sense of self and reduce them to mere objects of his will. In the end, it was David's own arrogance that led to his downfall. He believed that his plan was foolproof, that he had accounted for every possible variable. But he underestimated the resilience of his victims and the determination of law enforcement. When Sarah Johnson managed to escape and alert the authorities, the world he had so carefully constructed came crashing down. The discovery of the bunker and the horrors within it would shock the nation and reveal the true extent of David Carter's depravity. David's story is a chilling reminder of how evil can hide in plain sight, lurking behind the facade of normalcy. It's a testament to the importance of vigilance and the need to protect the most vulnerable members of our society. And it's a stark warning of what can happen when someone with a twisted mind and a meticulous plan is allowed to operate unchecked. How he lured his victims. David Carter's ability to lure his victims was as chilling as it was calculated. He didn't rely on brute force or random chance. Instead, he used manipulation, charm, and a deep understanding of human vulnerability to ensnare his targets. His methods were carefully crafted to exploit the weaknesses of those who were already struggling, making his crimes all the more sinister. Over time, investigators would piece together the full extent of his tactics, revealing a predator who was as cunning as he was cruel. David's victims all had one thing in common. They were women who had fallen through the cracks of society. Many were homeless, battling addiction, or estranged from their families. They were women who had no safety net, no one to turn to, and no one who would notice if they disappeared. David knew this, and he used it to his advantage. He specifically targeted places where desperation was palpable: homeless shelters, soup kitchens, bus stations, and even the parking lots of discount stores. These were places where people were often at their lowest, and where a kind word or a helping hand could seem like a lifeline. David's approach was disarmingly simple. He would present himself as a good Samaritan, someone who genuinely wanted to help. He dressed modestly, spoke softly, and carried himself in a way that made him seem non-threatening. He would strike up conversations with women who looked particularly vulnerable, often starting with a casual question like, "Are you okay?" or "Do you need help with anything?" His tone was always gentle, his demeanor warm and approachable. He knew how to make people feel safe, how to make them believe that he was someone they could trust. One of David's most effective tactics was his ability to read people. He had an uncanny knack for identifying what his potential victims needed most, and tailoring his approach accordingly. For some, it was the promise of a hot meal, or a warm place to sleep. For others, it was the offer of a job, or a chance to get back on their feet. He would listen to their stories, nodding sympathetically and offering words of encouragement. He made them feel seen, heard, and valued, something many of them hadn't experienced in a long time. David's promises were always carefully crafted to seem realistic. He didn't offer anything too grand or unbelievable, knowing that it might raise suspicion. Instead, he kept his offers simple and practical. "I know someone who's hiring," he might say, or "I have a spare room you can stay in until you get back on your feet." He would even go so far as to show them pictures of his house on his phone, pointing out the guest room or the kitchen where they could cook their own meals. It was all part of the illusion, a carefully constructed facade designed to make his victims feel like they were being given a second chance. Once he had gained their trust, David would make his move. He would offer to drive them to his house, often under the pretense of showing them the room or introducing them to someone who could help. For many of his victims, the offer seemed too good to pass up. They were tired, hungry, and desperate for a way out of their current situation. David's kindness felt like a beacon of hope, a chance to escape the darkness of their lives. They had no reason to suspect that they were walking into a trap. The drive to David's house was always uneventful, designed to put his victims at ease. He would make small talk, asking about their lives and their dreams for the future. He would crack jokes, play soft music on the radio, and even stop to buy them coffee or snacks. By the time they arrived at his house, most of his victims felt completely at ease. They believed that they had found someone who genuinely cared about them, someone who wanted to help. But the moment they stepped inside his house, everything changed. The warm, friendly demeanor that had put them at ease would vanish, replaced by a cold, calculating cruelty. David would lock the door behind them and lead them to the living room, where he had hidden the entrance to his underground bunker beneath a rug. At first, he would try to coax them down the stairs, using a mix of threats and false reassurances. "It's just a temporary setup," he might say. "I promise it's safe down there." If they resisted, he wouldn't hesitate to use force, dragging them down the stairs and locking them inside. For many of his victims, the realization of what was happening didn't fully sink in until it was too late. The kindness and compassion that had drawn them in were gone, replaced by the harsh reality of their new existence. They were trapped, alone, and completely at David's mercy. What made David's methods so terrifying was how effective they were. He didn't rely on violence or intimidation to lure his victims. He relied on their hope, their desperation, and their trust. He knew how to make them believe in him, how to make them feel like they were finally being given a chance to escape their struggles. And in doing so, he turned their own vulnerabilities against them, using their trust as a weapon to trap them in his twisted world. In the aftermath of his arrest, investigators would uncover just how many lives David had destroyed with his lies. Each victim had a story, a life that had been derailed by his manipulations. And while the details of their experiences varied, the pattern was always the same. A man who seemed too good to be true, offering a lifeline to those who needed it most, only to drag them into a nightmare from which there was no escape. The underground bunker, a living hell. The underground bunker that David Carter built beneath his unassuming home in Millfield, Ohio, was nothing short of a nightmare. It was a place meticulously designed to strip its captives of their humanity, a space where hope and light were extinguished, leaving only fear and despair. Investigators would later describe it as a living hell, a term that barely captured the horrors that unfolded within its walls. The bunker was not just a physical prison, it was a psychological weapon, crafted to break the spirits of those who were unfortunate enough to find themselves trapped inside. The entrance to the bunker was hidden beneath a rug in the living room of David's modest, single-story house. To the casual observer, the home appeared entirely ordinary, even quaint, but beneath the floorboards lay a steel hatch, secured with heavy locks and accessible only with a custom-made key. The hatch led to a steep, narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The air grew colder and heavier with each step, and the faint smell of mold and decay became stronger the deeper one went. For David's victims, this descent marked the beginning of their nightmare. The bunker itself was a labyrinth of small, cramped rooms connected by narrow passageways. It was built with reinforced concrete walls, making it virtually soundproof and impenetrable. The space was divided into several sections, each serving a specific purpose in David's twisted operation. There were holding cells where his captives were chained to the walls, a living area with makeshift beds and buckets for toilets, and even a small room equipped with cameras and recording equipment. Every detail of the bunker was designed to maximize David's control over his victims, while minimizing their chances of escape. The conditions inside the bunker were beyond inhumane. The air was thick and stale, with little ventilation to provide relief. The only light came from dim, flickering bulbs that cast eerie shadows on the walls, creating an atmosphere of perpetual gloom. The rooms were damp and cold, with water seeping through the cracks in the concrete. The smell of human waste, sweat, and decay permeated the air, making it almost unbearable to breathe. For the women trapped inside, the bunker was a sensory assault, a place where every moment was a reminder of their captivity. David's control over the environment was absolute. He used the bunker's design to manipulate and torment his captives, ensuring that they were completely dependent on him for their survival. The rooms were deliberately small and claustrophobic, leaving no space for privacy or comfort. The beds were little more than thin, dirty mattresses placed on the floor, and the blankets provided were tattered and insufficient against the cold. The buckets used as toilets were rarely emptied, forcing the women to endure the stench and filth. Food and water were rationed sparingly, given only as rewards for compliance or withheld as punishment for disobedience. One of the most horrifying aspects of the bunker was its psychological impact. David used the space not just to imprison his victims, but to break their spirits. He would isolate them for days or even weeks at a time, leaving them alone in the darkness with nothing but their thoughts and fears. The soundproof walls ensured that their screams and cries for help would go unheard, reinforcing the sense of hopelessness. He would play mind games, alternating between acts of kindness, such as providing extra food or allowing them to shower, and acts of cruelty, such as withholding necessities or subjecting them to verbal abuse. This cycle of hope and despair left the women emotionally shattered, unable to trust their own perceptions or instincts. The bunker also served as a tool for David's sadistic experiments in control. He installed hidden cameras throughout the space, allowing him to monitor his captives at all times. He would watch their every move, studying their behavior and using the information to manipulate them further. He would pit the women against each other, creating an atmosphere of mistrust and competition. In some cases, he forced them to participate in degrading acts, using the threat of violence or starvation to ensure their compliance. The cameras were not just a means of surveillance, they were a reminder that there was no escape, no privacy, and no reprieve from David's watchful eye. Perhaps the most chilling feature of the bunker was the punishment room, a small, windowless space where David would send his captives as a form of discipline. The room was completely dark, with no light or sound to provide any sense of orientation. Victims who were sent there described it as a place of pure terror, where the silence was so oppressive that it felt like a physical weight. Some were left in the punishment room for days at a time, emerging disoriented, dehydrated, and emotionally broken. The room was a testament to David's sadistic ingenuity, a tool designed to strip his victims of their sense of self and reduce them to a state of total submission. The psychological toll of the bunker was devastating. For the women trapped inside, time lost all meaning. Days blurred into nights and weeks stretched into months. The lack of natural light and fresh air left them physically weakened, while the constant fear and uncertainty eroded their mental health. Many of the women later described feeling as though they were no longer human, as though they had been reduced to mere objects in David's twisted game. The bunker was not just a prison, it was a place where identities were erased, where hope was extinguished, and where survival came at the cost of one's humanity. When investigators finally discovered the bunker, they were horrified by what they found. The walls were lined with chains and restraints, and the floors were littered with evidence of the women's suffering, discarded clothing, broken furniture, and the remnants of meager meals. The air was thick with the smell of decay, a grim reminder of the lives that had been lost within its walls. For the officers who entered the bunker, it was a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The discovery of the bunker shocked the nation, revealing the depths of David Carter's depravity and the unimaginable suffering he had inflicted on his victims. It was a place that defied comprehension, a living hell hidden beneath the surface of an ordinary home. For the women who survived, the bunker was a scar that would never fully heal, a reminder of the darkness they had endured and the strength it took to escape. And for the world, it was a chilling reminder of the evil that can hide in plain sight, lurking just beneath the surface of everyday life. Manipulation and control. David Carter's ability to manipulate and control his victims was one of the most terrifying aspects of his crimes. He didn't rely solely on physical force to dominate the women he imprisoned in his underground bunker. Instead, he used a calculated combination of psychological manipulation, emotional abuse, and coercion to break their spirits and ensure their compliance. His methods were disturbingly effective, turning his victims into prisoners not just of their physical environment but of their own minds. Over time, they became entirely dependent on him, unable to resist or even imagine a life outside the nightmare he had created. David's manipulation began the moment he lured his victims into his home. He was a master at reading people, quickly identifying their vulnerabilities and exploiting them to his advantage. Many of the women he targeted were already in desperate situations, homeless, estranged from their families, or struggling with addiction. They were women who had been let down by society, and David positioned himself as their savior. He offered them what they needed most: safety, stability, and a chance to rebuild their lives. By the time they realized his true intentions, it was too late. Once his victims were trapped in the bunker, David's manipulation escalated to a new level. He understood that physical imprisonment alone wasn't enough to maintain control. He needed to break their will and make them believe that escape was impossible. To achieve this, he employed a variety of psychological tactics designed to isolate, confuse, and demoralize his captives. One of David's primary methods of control was the use of fear. He made it clear from the beginning that he held absolute power over their lives. He would threaten them with violence, starvation, or even death if they disobeyed him. To reinforce these threats, he would occasionally carry out acts of cruelty, such as withholding food or water, physically assaulting them, or forcing them to witness the suffering of others. These acts served as a constant reminder of his dominance and their helplessness. David also used the bunker itself as a tool of manipulation. The dark, claustrophobic environment was designed to disorient and demoralize his victims. The lack of natural light and fresh air made it impossible to keep track of time, leaving the women in a perpetual state of confusion. Days blurred into nights, and weeks stretched into months, eroding their sense of reality. The soundproof walls ensured that their screams and cries for help would go unheard, reinforcing the idea that no one was coming to save them. The bunker became a world unto itself, a place where David's word was law, and where the outside world felt like a distant memory. Another key element of David's control was his ability to create a cycle of hope and despair. He would alternate between acts of kindness and acts of cruelty, keeping his victims in a constant state of emotional turmoil. For example, he might reward them with extra food or a blanket one day, only to punish them harshly the next for a perceived slight. This unpredictability made it impossible for the women to feel secure or to anticipate his behavior. They became hyper-vigilant, constantly trying to please him in the hope of avoiding punishment. Over time, this cycle of hope and despair broke down their resistance and made them more compliant. David also exploited the relationships between his captives to further his control. He would pit the women against each other, creating an atmosphere of mistrust and competition. He might reward one woman for betraying another or punish the group for the actions of a single individual. This tactic ensured that the women were too focused on surviving and protecting themselves to unite against him. It also deepened their sense of isolation, as they felt they couldn't even trust the people who were suffering alongside them. Perhaps the most insidious aspect of David's manipulation was his ability to make his victims feel dependent on him. Despite the horrors he inflicted, he positioned himself as their only source of survival. He controlled their access to food, water, and basic necessities, doling them out as rewards for good behavior. He would occasionally show small acts of kindness, such as allowing them to shower or giving them a small treat, to create the illusion that he cared for them. These moments of kindness were calculated to make the women feel grateful to him, even as he continued to abuse and exploit them. Over time, some of the women began to see him not just as their captor but as their provider, a phenomenon often associated with Stockholm Syndrome. David also used psychological manipulation to erode his victims' sense of self-worth. He would belittle and demean them, calling them worthless or telling them that no one cared about them. He would remind them of their past mistakes or struggles, using their vulnerabilities against them. By breaking down their self-esteem, he made them more susceptible to his control. Many of the women began to internalize his words, believing that they truly were worthless and that they deserved the treatment they were receiving. In addition to his psychological tactics, David employed physical restraints to maintain control. The women were often chained to the walls or confined to small, cramped spaces, making escape physically impossible. He would rotate their positions within the bunker, moving them from one room to another to keep them disoriented. Even when they were not physically restrained, the fear of punishment and the psychological barriers he had created were enough to keep them from attempting to escape. David's manipulation extended to the outside world as well. He was careful to maintain the appearance of a normal life, ensuring that no one suspected what was happening beneath his home. He paid his bills on time, kept his yard tidy, and even attended community events on occasion. This facade of normalcy made it even harder for his victims to believe that anyone would come looking for them. They felt completely invisible, as though they had been erased from the world. The effects of David's manipulation were devastating. By the time the women were rescued, many of them were so broken that they struggled to adjust to life outside the bunker. Some even expressed sympathy for David, a testament to the depth of his psychological control. His ability to manipulate and dominate his victims was a chilling reminder of the power of the human mind and the darkness that can reside within it. David Carter's methods of manipulation and control were as calculated as they were cruel. He didn't just imprison his victims physically, he imprisoned them mentally and emotionally, creating a world where he was the sole authority and where resistance felt impossible. His actions left scars that would last a lifetime, not just on the women he victimized, but on everyone who learned of the horrors that unfolded in his underground bunker. The villain's purpose. David Carter's purpose behind his horrifying crimes was as complex as it was disturbing. Unlike many criminals who act out of impulse or desperation, David's actions were deliberate, calculated, and deeply rooted in his twisted psyche. His motives went far beyond simple greed or lust. They were driven by a dark need for power, control, and domination. To truly understand the depths of his depravity, one must examine the layers of his intentions, which combined elements of sadism, psychological manipulation, and a desire to create a world where he was the ultimate authority. At the core of David's purpose was his insatiable need for control. For David, the bunker was not just a physical prison for his victims, it was a manifestation of his desire to create a world where he held absolute power. In his everyday life, David was an unremarkable man, someone who had no real influence or authority. He had lost his job as a construction foreman years earlier, and his social life was virtually non-existent. He was invisible to the world, a man who felt powerless and insignificant. The bunker became his way of reclaiming that power, of building a space where he was no longer a nobody but a godlike figure who controlled every aspect of his victims' lives. David's need for control extended to every detail of his operation. He didn't just want to imprison his victims physically, he wanted to dominate them mentally and emotionally. He wanted to strip them of their autonomy, their sense of self, and their ability to resist. By controlling their access to food, water, and even basic human necessities, he reduced them to a state of total dependence. He wanted them to see him as their only source of survival, to believe that their lives were entirely in his hands. This level of control gave David a sense of power that he had never experienced in his ordinary life, and it became an addiction that drove him to commit increasingly heinous acts. Another layer of David's purpose was his sadistic desire to inflict suffering. For David, the bunker was not just a place to hold his victims, it was a stage for his cruelty. He derived pleasure from watching his victims suffer, from seeing the fear in their eyes and hearing their cries for help. He used the bunker's design to amplify their suffering, creating an environment that was as psychologically tormenting as it was physically oppressive. The dark, claustrophobic spaces, the lack of natural light, and the constant sense of isolation were all tools he used to break his victims' spirits. David didn't just want to imprison his victims, he wanted to destroy them, to reduce them to mere shadows of their former selves. David's sadism was not limited to physical suffering. He also took pleasure in manipulating his victims emotionally, playing mind games that left them confused, hopeless, and entirely at his mercy. He would alternate between acts of kindness and acts of cruelty, creating a cycle of hope and despair that kept his victims in a constant state of emotional turmoil. He would pit them against each other, forcing them to compete for his approval or punishing the group for the actions of a single individual. This psychological manipulation was a key part of David's purpose, as it allowed him to exert even greater control over his victims while feeding his sadistic tendencies. In addition to his need for control and his sadistic impulses, David's actions were also driven by a deep-seated desire for validation. In his everyday life, David was a man who felt overlooked and unimportant. He had no close friends, no romantic relationships, and no meaningful connections to the world around him. The bunker became a way for him to assert his importance, to create a space where he was the center of attention. His victims were forced to focus entirely on him, to cater to his every whim and obey his every command. In the twisted world of the bunker, David was no longer invisible. He was the most important person in the room, the one who held all the power. David's purpose also had a financial component, though it was secondary to his psychological and emotional motives. Investigators discovered that he had been using his victims to produce illicit content, which he sold online to fund his operation. This content not only provided him with a source of income, but also allowed him to share his sadistic fantasies with others, further feeding his ego and sense of power. While the financial aspect of his crimes was significant, it was clear that money was not David's primary motivation. For him, the bunker was not about profit, it was about control, domination, and the fulfillment of his darkest desires. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of David's purpose was his long-term vision for the bunker. This was not a temporary operation or a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a carefully planned and meticulously executed project that he intended to sustain indefinitely. He had spent years building the bunker, designing it to be self-sufficient and virtually undetectable. He had stockpiled supplies, installed a ventilation system, and even created a backup power source to ensure that the bunker could function without interruption. David's goal was to create a world where he could continue his crimes indefinitely, a place where he could exert his control and inflict his cruelty without fear of discovery. David's long-term vision also included plans to expand his operation. Investigators found evidence that he had been scouting additional victims and considering ways to increase the capacity of the bunker. He had detailed notes on potential targets, as well as sketches of modifications he wanted to make to the bunker to accommodate more captives. This level of planning revealed the depth of his depravity and his unwavering commitment to his twisted purpose. For David, the bunker was not just a means to an end, it was his life's work, the culmination of years of planning and preparation. In the end, David's purpose was a chilling combination of power, control, sadism, and validation. He didn't just want to imprison his victims, he wanted to create a world where he was the ultimate authority, where his word was law, and where his victims existed solely to serve his needs. His actions were a horrifying reminder of the darkness that can reside within the human mind, and the lengths to which some individuals will go to fulfill their twisted desires. David Carter's purpose was not just to commit crimes, it was to create a world where he could live out his darkest fantasies, a world that he believed he could control forever. Discovery and rescue. The discovery and rescue of David Carter's victims was nothing short of miraculous, a moment of hope and justice in a case that had been defined by unimaginable darkness. For years, David had operated in complete secrecy, his crimes hidden beneath the surface of his quiet, unassuming home in Millfield, Ohio. But as meticulous as his planning had been, he had underestimated the resilience and determination of one of his captives. It was her courage and quick thinking that ultimately led to the unraveling of his twisted world and the liberation of the women who had suffered in silence for so long. The turning point came on a cold November evening in 2018, when 24-year-old Sarah Johnson, one of David's captives, managed to escape from the underground bunker. Sarah had been held captive for nearly 6 months, enduring the physical and psychological torment that David inflicted on all his victims. But despite the horrors she faced, she never gave up hope of escaping. Over time she began to study the bunker, looking for weaknesses in its design and opportunities to break free. She knew that her chances were slim, but she also knew that staying meant certain death, or worse. Sarah's opportunity came when David made a rare mistake. He had left the ventilation grate in one of the bunker's rooms slightly loose, likely during a routine maintenance check. Sarah noticed the loosened screws and realized that it might be her only chance to escape. Over the course of several days, she worked quietly and methodically, using a piece of broken metal to unscrew the grate. She had to be careful not to make any noise as David monitored the bunker through hidden cameras and could appear at any moment. It was a painstaking process, but Sarah's determination never wavered. Finally, on the night of her escape, Sarah managed to remove the grate and crawl into the narrow ventilation duct. The space was dark, filthy, and barely wide enough for her to move, but she forced herself to keep going. She crawled for what felt like hours, her body scraped and bruised by the rough metal walls. The air was thick and suffocating, and she had to fight the urge to panic, but eventually she saw a faint glimmer of light ahead, the exit to the outside world. With one final push, she emerged from the duct and found herself in the woods behind David's house. Sarah was barefoot, freezing and disoriented, but she didn't stop. She ran as fast as she could, her heart pounding with fear that David might discover her escape and come after her. She stumbled through the woods, her feet bleeding from the rough terrain, until she reached a gas station about a mile away. There she borrowed a phone from a startled clerk and called 911. Her voice was shaky and filled with terror as she told the dispatcher about the bunker, the other women still trapped inside, and the horrors she had endured. The dispatcher immediately recognized the urgency of the situation and dispatched officers to the address Sarah provided. When police arrived at David Carter's home, they were met with an eerie silence. The house was dark, and there were no signs of activity. Officers knocked on the door, but there was no response. Fearing for the safety of the other captives, they forced their way inside. The house appeared ordinary at first glance: modest furniture, neatly arranged belongings, and no obvious signs of a crime. But as they searched the property, they noticed something unusual: a heavy steel hatch hidden beneath a rug in the living room. It was locked, and it took several officers to pry it open. What they found beneath the hatch would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The steep staircase led to the underground bunker, a dark, claustrophobic space that reeked of mold, decay, and human suffering. The officers were immediately struck by the oppressive atmosphere, the dim, flickering lights, the damp concrete walls, and the makeshift beds where the captives had been forced to sleep. The air was thick and suffocating, and the soundproof walls made the space eerily silent, amplifying the sense of isolation. As the officers moved through the bunker, they found 3 women still alive, chained to the walls in separate rooms. They were malnourished, bruised, and visibly traumatized, their eyes wide with fear and disbelief. The women were so weak that they could barely speak, but their relief at seeing the officers was palpable. One of them, a 19-year-old named Emily Carter, no relation to David, broke down in tears as she was unchained, whispering, "I thought no one would ever find us." The officers reassured the women that they were safe and quickly escorted them out of the bunker. The rescue operation was not without its challenges. David Carter, realizing that the police had discovered his secret, attempted to flee the scene. He was apprehended a few blocks away after a brief foot chase, during which he reportedly shouted incoherent threats and denials. When he was finally subdued and taken into custody, his demeanor shifted from defiance to eerie calm, as though he had already accepted his fate. The aftermath of the rescue was a whirlwind of activity. The women were taken to a nearby hospital where they received medical treatment and counseling. Their physical injuries were severe but treatable, and their emotional scars would take much longer to heal. Investigators began the painstaking process of documenting the bunker and collecting evidence, uncovering the full extent of David's crimes. They found hidden cameras, journals detailing his plans, and even a list of potential future victims. The bunker itself was a testament to David's meticulous planning and depravity. A space designed to inflict maximum suffering while remaining hidden from the outside world. News of the rescue spread quickly, shocking the nation and drawing attention to the small town of Millfield. Reporters and camera crews descended on the area, turning it into a media circus. The story of Sarah's escape and the bravery of the officers who rescued the other women became a symbol of hope and resilience in the face of unimaginable evil. The town, once known for its quiet charm, became synonymous with one of the most horrifying criminal cases in recent history. For the survivors, the road to recovery was long and difficult. They faced not only the physical and emotional trauma of their captivity, but also the challenges of reintegrating into a world that had moved on without them. They were supported by a network of counselors, advocates, and community members who rallied around them, determined to help them rebuild their lives. Sarah, in particular, was hailed as a hero for her courage and determination, though she often downplayed her role, saying, "I just did what I had to do to survive." The discovery and rescue of David Carter's victims was a moment of triumph in a case that had been defined by darkness and despair. It was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, the importance of vigilance, and the power of hope. While the scars of David's crimes would never fully heal, the rescue marked the beginning of a new chapter for the survivors, a chapter defined not by fear and suffering, but by resilience, recovery, and the pursuit of justice. The victims' reactions. The reactions of David Carter's victims in the aftermath of their rescue were as complex and multifaceted as the trauma they had endured. For years, these women had been subjected to unimaginable physical, emotional, and psychological abuse, confined to a world of darkness and despair. Their responses to freedom reflected the profound impact of their captivity, the resilience of the human spirit, and the long road to recovery that lay ahead. Each woman's reaction was shaped by her unique experiences in the bunker, her coping mechanisms, and the psychological scars left by years of manipulation and control. Initial reactions: relief, shock, and disorientation. When the women were first rescued, their immediate reactions were a mixture of overwhelming relief and profound shock. For some, the realization that they were finally free brought an outpouring of emotion, tears, sobs, and expressions of gratitude to the officers who had saved them. Emily Carter, one of the youngest victims, reportedly clung to one of the officers and whispered, "Thank you for finding us. I thought I was going to die down there." Her words captured the sense of hopelessness that had defined their lives in the bunker, and the immense relief of knowing that their ordeal was finally over. However, not all the women reacted with such clarity. For others, the transition from captivity to freedom was deeply disorienting. After years of living in darkness, confined to a small, oppressive space, the outside world felt alien and overwhelming. The bright lights of the hospital, the noise of the media frenzy, and the sudden influx of people, doctors, police officers, reporters, were almost too much to bear. Some of the women struggled to process what was happening, their minds still trapped in the survival mode that had kept them alive in the bunker. They were free, but they didn't yet feel free. The psychological impact, trauma, and Stockholm Syndrome. The psychological impact of their captivity was profound, and it manifested in ways that were both expected and deeply unsettling. All of the women exhibited symptoms of severe trauma, including anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. They experienced flashbacks to their time in the bunker, triggered by seemingly innocuous sights, sounds, or smells. Many of them struggled with nightmares, waking up in a panic and believing they were still trapped underground. The physical scars on their bodies were a constant reminder of their suffering, but it was the emotional scars that proved the hardest to heal. One of the most perplexing and controversial aspects of the victims' reactions was the presence of Stockholm Syndrome in several of the women. Despite the horrific abuse they had endured, some of the victims expressed sympathy for David Carter, even going so far as to defend him in the early days after their rescue. They described him as a complicated man who had moments of kindness, such as providing extra food or allowing them to shower. One victim, 27-year-old Rachel Simmons, shocked investigators when she said, "He wasn't always a monster, sometimes he tried to take care of us." These statements were difficult for the public to understand, but psychologists explained that they were a survival mechanism, a way for the women to rationalize their captivity and maintain a sense of hope in an otherwise hopeless situation. The presence of Stockholm Syndrome also highlighted the depth of David's psychological manipulation. He had created a world where he was both the source of their suffering and their only means of survival. By alternating between cruelty and kindness, he had conditioned his victims to see him as a complex figure rather than a purely evil one. This emotional manipulation left many of the women feeling conflicted about their feelings toward him, even after they were free. It was a testament to the power of psychological abuse and the ways in which it can distort a person's perception of reality, the struggle to rebuild their lives. In the months and years following their rescue, the women faced the daunting task of rebuilding their lives. For many, the transition to freedom was far from easy. They had spent years in an environment where every aspect of their lives was controlled, and the sudden return to autonomy was both liberating and terrifying. Simple tasks like going to the grocery store or walking down the street felt overwhelming, as they were constantly on edge, fearing that someone might be watching or following them. The outside world, which they had longed to return to, now felt unsafe and unpredictable. Reconnecting with family and friends was another significant challenge. Many of the women had been estranged from their loved ones before their abduction, and the years of captivity had only deepened those divides. Some families struggled to understand the extent of the trauma their loved ones had endured, while others were unsure of how to provide the support they needed. For the women, rebuilding these relationships required patience, vulnerability, and a willingness to confront painful memories. It was a slow and often painful process, but it was also a crucial step in their journey toward healing. Therapy played a central role in the recovery process for all of the women. They worked with trauma specialists to address the psychological scars left by their captivity, learning to process their emotions, confront their fears, and rebuild their sense of self-worth. Group therapy sessions allowed them to connect with one another, sharing their experiences and finding solace in the knowledge that they were not alone. While the road to recovery was long and filled with setbacks, the women showed remarkable resilience, drawing strength from one another and from the support of their therapists and advocates. Public reaction and the burden of visibility. The public reaction to the case added another layer of complexity to the victims' recovery. The media frenzy surrounding their rescue turned them into instant celebrities, with their faces and stories plastered across newspapers, television screens, and social media. While many people expressed sympathy and support, others were less kind, questioning the victims' actions and even blaming them for their captivity. The presence of Stockholm Syndrome in some of the women became a particular point of controversy, with critics accusing them of being weak or complicit in their own abuse. These judgments were deeply hurtful, and only added to the emotional burden the women were already carrying. For the victims, the sudden visibility was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, it brought attention to the issue of human trafficking and the psychological impact of captivity, sparking important conversations about trauma and recovery. On the other hand, it made it difficult for the women to move on with their lives, as they were constantly reminded of their ordeal by the media and the public. Some of the women chose to embrace their visibility, using their platform to advocate for other survivors and raise awareness about the issues they had faced. Others retreated from the spotlight, seeking privacy and anonymity as they worked to rebuild their lives, resilience, and the road ahead. Despite the immense challenges they faced, the women showed incredible resilience in the aftermath of their rescue. They refused to let their captivity define them, choosing instead to focus on their recovery and their future. For some, this meant pursuing education or career opportunities that had been denied to them during their years in the bunker. For others, it meant reconnecting with their families, building new relationships, and finding ways to reclaim their sense of identity. While the scars of their ordeal would never fully heal, they were determined to move forward, drawing strength from their shared experiences and the support of their communities. The reactions of David Carter's victims were a testament to the complexity of trauma and the resilience of the human spirit. Their journey from captivity to freedom was fraught with pain, confusion, and setbacks, but it was also marked by moments of hope, courage, and determination. In the face of unimaginable suffering, these women found the strength to survive, to heal, and to reclaim their lives. Their stories serve as a powerful reminder of the importance of compassion, understanding, and support for survivors of trauma, as well as the enduring capacity of the human spirit to overcome even the darkest of circumstances. Investigation and evidence. The investigation into David Carter's crimes was one of the most exhaustive and disturbing cases in modern criminal history. From the moment the police uncovered the underground bunker and rescued the surviving victims, it became clear that this was not an ordinary case of abduction. The sheer scale of Carter's operation, the meticulous planning that had gone into constructing the bunker, and the psychological and physical torment inflicted on his victims, required a thorough and painstaking investigation. Every detail had to be documented, every piece of evidence carefully analyzed, and every lead followed to ensure that justice was served. The investigation not only revealed the depths of Carter's depravity, but also highlighted the resilience of the survivors and the dedication of law enforcement to uncover the truth. The initial discovery of the bunker. The investigation began with the dramatic discovery of the underground bunker, a hidden world of horror buried beneath Carter's unassuming suburban home. When officers first entered the bunker, they were struck by the oppressive atmosphere, the damp, musty air, the dim lighting, and the eerie silence that seemed to amplify the suffering that had taken place there. The bunker was a labyrinth of interconnected rooms, each designed with a specific purpose. Investigators found makeshift sleeping quarters where the victims had been chained to the walls, a small kitchen area stocked with non-perishable food, and a bathroom that was little more than a bucket and a drain. The walls were lined with soundproofing material, ensuring that no noise could escape to the surface. One of the most chilling discoveries was a room filled with surveillance equipment. Carter had installed hidden cameras throughout the bunker, allowing him to monitor his victims at all times. The footage was stored on a series of hard drives, which investigators seized as evidence. These recordings provided a horrifying glimpse into the daily lives of the captives, documenting the abuse they endured and the psychological tactics Carter used to maintain control. The footage would later become a key piece of evidence in the case, though it was so disturbing that many investigators struggled to watch it. The forensic examination of the bunker forensic experts were brought in to meticulously document every inch of the bunker. The space was treated as a crime scene, with investigators collecting fingerprints, DNA samples, and other physical evidence. The locks and chains used to restrain the victims were carefully removed and analyzed, as were the tools and materials Carter had used to construct the bunker. The soundproofing material on the walls was tested to confirm its effectiveness, and the ventilation system was examined to determine how Carter had managed to keep the bunker habitable for years without detection. One of the most significant forensic discoveries was the remains of two victims who had not survived their captivity. Their bodies were found buried in a shallow grave within the bunker, wrapped in plastic and concealed beneath a layer of concrete. The autopsies revealed that they had died from a combination of malnutrition, dehydration, and physical abuse. The discovery of these remains added 2 counts of murder to the charges against Carter and underscored the deadly consequences of his actions, uncovering Carter's financial trail. As the investigation progressed, detectives began to uncover the financial side of Carter's operation. While his primary motivation appeared to be psychological and sadistic, he had also used his victims to generate income. Investigators discovered that Carter had been producing and selling illicit content online, using the footage from the hidden cameras in the bunker. He had set up a network of encrypted accounts and cryptocurrency wallets to facilitate these transactions, making it difficult to trace the money. However, forensic analysts were eventually able to track the flow of funds, revealing a web of buyers and distributors who had profited from Carter's crimes. The financial evidence not only demonstrated the extent of Carter's operation but also helped to identify potential accomplices. While Carter had acted alone in constructing and maintaining the bunker, the investigation revealed that he had communicated with others online who shared his depraved interests. These individuals were tracked down and questioned, leading to several arrests and the dismantling of a broader network of exploitation. This aspect of the case highlighted the dark underbelly of the internet and the need for greater vigilance in combating online criminal activity. The role of victim testimonies. While the physical evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies of the surviving victims were perhaps the most powerful aspect of the case. Each woman provided a detailed account of her experience, describing how Carter had lured her into the bunker, the methods he used to control and manipulate her, and the daily horrors she endured. Their stories were remarkably consistent, painting a clear picture of Carter's tactics and the psychological toll of their captivity. The victims' testimonies also revealed the extent of Carter's cruelty. They described how he would alternate between acts of kindness and acts of brutality, creating a cycle of hope and despair that kept them in a constant state of fear. They spoke of the isolation they felt, the hopelessness of their situation, and the moments when they thought they would never be found. Despite the trauma they had endured, the women showed incredible strength and courage in recounting their experiences, determined to ensure that Carter was held accountable for his actions. Carter's journals and psychological profile. During the search of Carter's home and bunker, investigators discovered a collection of journals and notebooks that provided invaluable insight into his mind. These writings revealed the inner workings of Carter's twisted psyche, detailing his plans for the bunker, his methods for selecting and luring victims, and his justifications for his actions. The journals also included sketches of the bunker's layout, lists of supplies, and notes on how to avoid detection. Carter's writings painted a picture of a man who was meticulous, calculating, and deeply disturbed. Psychologists who reviewed the journals and interviewed Carter described him as a classic example of a narcissistic and sadistic personality. He derived pleasure from the suffering of others and saw his victims as objects to be controlled and manipulated. His writings revealed a deep need for power and validation, as well as a complete lack of empathy for his victims. This psychological profile would later play a key role in the prosecution's case, helping to establish Carter's motives and the premeditated nature of his crimes. Carter's interrogation and behavior. David Carter's behavior during the investigation was as chilling as his crimes. When he was first apprehended, he appeared calm and composed, as though he had already accepted his fate. During his interrogation, he showed little remorse, often deflecting blame onto his victims or attempting to justify his actions. He claimed that the women had consented to being in the bunker, a statement that was quickly disproven by the overwhelming evidence against him. As the investigation continued, Carter's demeanor shifted. He became increasingly agitated and uncooperative, refusing to answer questions and attempting to disrupt the proceedings. At one point, he even tried to harm himself in his cell, prompting authorities to place him under constant surveillance. His erratic behavior only reinforced the image of a man who was deeply disturbed and unrepentant. The prosecution's case. By the time the investigation was complete, prosecutors had built an airtight case against David Carter. The evidence was overwhelming. The physical layout of the bunker, the surveillance footage, the journals and financial records, the forensic analysis, and the testimonies of the survivors all pointed to his guilt. The prosecution argued that Carter's crimes were not the result of impulse or desperation, but a carefully planned and executed operation driven by his need for control and his sadistic desires. The trial itself was a harrowing experience for everyone involved. The survivors were forced to relive their trauma as they testified in court, while jurors and spectators struggled to comprehend the depths of Carter's depravity. The evidence presented was so graphic and disturbing that portions of the trial were closed to the public to protect the dignity of the victims. Conclusion of the investigation. The investigation into David Carter's crimes was a monumental effort that required the collaboration of law enforcement, forensic experts, financial analysts, and victim advocates. It was a case that tested the limits of human resilience and the capacity for justice in the face of unimaginable evil. In the end, the evidence was undeniable, and David Carter was convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, sexual assault, murder, and other charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would never harm another person again. The investigation not only brought justice to Carter's victims, but also shed light on the broader issues of exploitation, online criminal networks, and the importance of vigilance in protecting vulnerable individuals. It was a case that left a lasting impact on everyone involved, a stark reminder of the darkness that can exist in the human mind, and the strength and determination required to confront it. The trial and sentencing. The trial of David Carter was one of the most harrowing and widely publicized criminal cases in recent history. It was not only a legal battle to hold Carter accountable for his heinous crimes, but also a deeply emotional and psychological ordeal for the survivors, their families, and the public. The courtroom became a stage where the full extent of Carter's depravity was laid bare, and the resilience of his victims was put on display. The trial was a meticulous and emotionally charged process lasting several months as prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, survivors recounted their traumatic experiences, and Carter's defense attempted to mitigate his culpability. In the end, the trial culminated in a verdict and sentence that reflected the gravity of his crimes and the justice demanded by his victims and society. The pre-trial proceedings. Before the trial officially began, the pre-trial proceedings were marked by intense media scrutiny and legal maneuvering. David Carter's arrest and the discovery of the underground bunker had already captured national and international attention, with the public demanding swift justice. The prosecution, led by a team of experienced attorneys, worked tirelessly to build an airtight case against Carter. They compiled a mountain of evidence, including forensic findings, surveillance footage, financial records, and the testimonies of the survivors. The prosecution's goal was clear: to ensure that Carter would face the maximum penalty for his crimes. Carter's defense team, on the other hand, sought to delay the trial and challenge the admissibility of key pieces of evidence. They argued that some of the evidence, particularly the surveillance footage and Carter's journals, violated his right to privacy. They also attempted to portray Carter as mentally ill, claiming that he was incapable of fully understanding the consequences of his actions. These arguments were met with fierce opposition from the prosecution, who argued that Carter's actions were premeditated, calculated, and driven by a sadistic desire for control and power. The pre-trial hearings also addressed the issue of media coverage. Given the graphic nature of the evidence and the intense public interest in the case, the judge imposed strict restrictions on media access to the courtroom. Portions of the trial, particularly those involving the most disturbing evidence, were closed to the public to protect the dignity and privacy of the survivors. These measures were necessary to ensure a fair trial and to shield the victims from further trauma. The opening statements. The trial officially began with opening statements from both the prosecution and the defense. The prosecution's lead attorney delivered a powerful and emotional opening statement outlining the horrific nature of Carter's crimes and the suffering endured by his victims. This case, the attorney began, is about unimaginable cruelty, manipulation, and the complete disregard for human life. David Carter created a world of darkness and despair where he held absolute power over his victims. Today, we will shine a light on that darkness and ensure that justice is served. The defense, in contrast, sought to humanize Carter and downplay the premeditated nature of his actions. They argued that Carter was a deeply troubled individual who had suffered from mental health issues for years. David Carter is not a monster, the defense attorney stated. He is a man who made terrible choices, driven by a mind that was not well. We ask the court to consider his mental state and the circumstances that led to these tragic events. The prosecution's case. The prosecution's case was built on a foundation of overwhelming evidence, and they methodically presented it to the jury over the course of several weeks. The centerpiece of their case was the physical evidence from the bunker, which painted a chilling picture of the environment in which the victims had been held. Photographs and videos of the bunker were shown to the jury, revealing the cramped, dark, and oppressive conditions. The soundproof walls, the chains and locks, and the makeshift living quarters all underscored the extent of Carter's planning and the inhumane treatment of his victims. The surveillance footage recovered from the bunker was perhaps the most damning piece of evidence. The prosecution played selected clips for the jury, showing Carter's interactions with his victims. The footage documented the physical and psychological abuse he inflicted, as well as the methods he used to maintain control. While the videos were deeply disturbing, they were crucial in demonstrating the premeditated and sadistic nature of Carter's actions. The prosecution also presented Carter's journals and notebooks, which provided a window into his twisted mind. These writings detailed his plans for the bunker, his methods for selecting and luring victims, and his justifications for his actions. The journals revealed a man who was meticulous, calculating, and devoid of empathy. They also included chilling entries in which Carter expressed satisfaction with his ability to control and manipulate his victims. The most powerful moments of the prosecution's case came when the survivors took the stand. Each woman recounted her experience in the bunker, describing how Carter had lured her into captivity, the abuse she endured, and the psychological tactics he used to break her will. Their testimonies were raw, emotional, and deeply moving. Many jurors were brought to tears as the survivors described the hopelessness they felt and the strength it took to survive. Despite the trauma they had endured, the survivors showed incredible courage and resilience, determined to ensure that Carter was held accountable for his actions. The defense's case. The defense faced an uphill battle in light of the overwhelming evidence against Carter. Their primary strategy was to argue that Carter was mentally ill, and therefore not fully responsible for his actions. They called several mental health experts to testify, who described Carter as suffering from severe personality disorders, including narcissistic and antisocial tendencies. The defense argued that these disorders impaired Carter's ability to understand the consequences of his actions and that he should be sentenced to life in a mental health facility rather than prison. The defense also attempted to shift some of the blame onto the victims, suggesting that they had opportunities to escape or resist, but failed to do so. This line of argument was met with outrage from the prosecution and the public, as it ignored the psychological manipulation and fear that Carter had used to control his victims. The defense's arguments ultimately failed to resonate with the jury, who saw them as an attempt to deflect responsibility from Carter. The closing arguments. In their closing arguments, the prosecution emphasized the premeditated and sadistic nature of Carter's crimes. David Carter is not a man who acted out of impulse or desperation, the lead prosecutor stated. He is a predator who carefully planned and executed his crimes, driven by a desire for power and control. His actions were deliberate, calculated, and inexcusable. The evidence is clear, and the survivors' voices demand justice. The defense, in their closing arguments, reiterated their claim that Carter was mentally ill and deserved compassion. "We are not asking you to excuse David Carter's actions," the defense attorney said. "We're asking you to recognize that he is a deeply troubled individual who needs help, not condemnation." The verdict. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous verdict. David Carter was found guilty on all charges, including multiple counts of kidnapping, sexual assault, and first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and emotion as the verdict was read. The survivors, many of whom had attended the trial, embraced one another and wept, knowing that justice had finally been served. The sentencing. During the sentencing phase, the prosecution argued for the maximum penalty, emphasizing the severity of Carter's crimes and the lasting impact on his victims. The survivors were given the opportunity to deliver victim impact statements, and their words were powerful and heart-wrenching. "You took everything from me," one survivor said, addressing Carter directly. "But you didn't break me. I'm still here, and I'm stronger than you'll ever be." The judge, in delivering the sentence, condemned Carter's actions in the strongest terms. "Your crimes are among the most heinous this court has ever seen," the judge said. "You showed no remorse, no empathy, and no regard for the lives you destroyed. You are a danger to society, and you will never harm another person again." Carter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. The aftermath. The trial and sentencing of David Carter brought a sense of closure to the survivors and their families, though the scars of their ordeal would remain. The case also sparked important conversations about the psychological impact of captivity. the need for better protections for vulnerable individuals, and the importance of holding perpetrators accountable. For the survivors, the verdict was a testament to their strength and resilience, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable darkness, justice can prevail. Social impact. The case of David Carter and the horrors of his underground bunker sent shockwaves through society, leaving a profound and lasting impact on multiple levels. It was not just a story of unimaginable cruelty and survival, but also a wake-up call that exposed the vulnerabilities in social systems, the dark underbelly of human behavior, and the resilience of survivors. The case sparked widespread public outrage, intense media scrutiny, and a national conversation about issues ranging from mental health and victim advocacy to law enforcement practices and the dangers of online criminal networks. The ripple effects of the case extended far beyond the courtroom, influencing public policy, inspiring activism, and reshaping societal attitudes toward trauma, justice, and the human capacity for both evil and resilience. Public outrage and media frenzy. From the moment the story broke, the public was captivated and horrified by the details of David Carter's crimes, the discovery of the underground bunker, the years of captivity endured by the victims, and the sheer depravity of Carter's actions dominated headlines for months. News outlets across the country and around the world covered the case extensively, with journalists dissecting every detail of the investigation, trial, and sentencing. The media frenzy turned the victims into unwilling public figures, with their faces and stories plastered across newspapers, television screens, and social media. The public's reaction was a mixture of outrage, sympathy, and disbelief. Many people struggled to comprehend how such atrocities could occur in a seemingly ordinary suburban neighborhood without anyone noticing. The case raised uncomfortable questions about societal complacency and the failure to recognize warning signs. Neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances of Carter were interviewed, and many expressed shock, describing him as quiet and unassuming. This disconnect between Carter's outward appearance and his monstrous actions fueled a broader conversation about the hidden nature of abuse and the importance of vigilance in protecting vulnerable individuals. The role of social media played a significant role in amplifying the case's impact. Platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram became hubs for public discourse, with hashtags such as #JusticeForTheVictims and #DavidCarterCase trending for weeks. While social media allowed for widespread awareness and support for the survivors, it also had its downsides. The victims faced invasive scrutiny, with some users speculating about their actions during captivity or questioning their responses after being rescued. This online victim blaming highlighted the persistent stigma surrounding trauma and the need for greater public education about the psychological effects of abuse. At the same time, social media became a powerful tool for advocacy. Activists and organizations used the platform to raise awareness about human trafficking, psychological manipulation, and the long-term effects of captivity. Survivors of similar experiences came forward to share their stories, creating a sense of solidarity and community. The case also inspired crowdfunding campaigns to support the victims' recovery, with thousands of people donating to help them rebuild their lives. Impact on law enforcement and public safety. The case exposed significant gaps in law enforcement practices and public safety measures, prompting calls for reform. One of the most pressing questions raised by the case was how Carter had managed to construct and operate the bunker for years without detection. Investigators revealed that Carter had gone to great lengths to conceal his activities, using soundproofing materials, underground construction techniques, and careful planning to avoid suspicion. However, the case also highlighted missed opportunities for intervention. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises and noticing unusual activity around Carter's property, but failed to report their concerns to authorities. This lack of action underscored the importance of community vigilance and the need for public education about recognizing and reporting signs of abuse. In response to the case, law enforcement agencies across the country reviewed their protocols for handling missing persons cases and investigating reports of suspicious behavior. Training programs were updated to include information about psychological manipulation, Stockholm Syndrome, and the tactics used by perpetrators to maintain control over their victims. The case also led to increased funding for specialized units focused on human trafficking and exploitation, as well as the development of new technologies for detecting hidden spaces like underground bunkers. Policy changes and legislative action. The David Carter case became a catalyst for legislative action at both the state and federal levels. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at strengthening protections for vulnerable individuals and improving the resources available to survivors of abuse. Key policy changes included enhanced penalties for human trafficking and exploitation. Legislators increased the penalties for crimes involving human trafficking, kidnapping, and sexual exploitation, ensuring that perpetrators faced harsher consequences for their actions. Improved support for survivors. New laws were passed to provide survivors with access to counseling, housing, and financial assistance. These measures aim to help survivors rebuild their lives and reduce the long-term impact of their trauma. Mandatory reporting laws. Some states introduced stricter mandatory reporting laws requiring individuals to report suspected abuse or exploitation to authorities. These laws were accompanied by public awareness campaigns to educate people about their responsibilities and the signs of abuse. Regulation of online platforms. The case also drew attention to the role of online platforms in facilitating criminal activity. Lawmakers called for greater regulation of the internet, including stricter monitoring of encrypted networks, and increased accountability for platforms that failed to prevent the distribution of illicit content. The psychological and cultural impact. The case had a profound psychological impact on the public, forcing people to confront the darker aspects of human behavior and the fragility of safety and trust. Many people reported feeling a heightened sense of vigilance and anxiety, particularly in suburban communities where the idea of such crimes seemed unthinkable. Parents became more protective of their children, and communities began organizing neighborhood watch programs to increase security. Culturally, the case sparked a broader conversation about trauma, resilience, and the human capacity for survival. The survivors' stories became a source of inspiration for many, demonstrating the strength and courage it takes to endure and recover from unimaginable suffering. Their journey also highlighted the importance of compassion and support for trauma survivors, challenging societal attitudes that often stigmatize or blame victims. The case also influenced popular culture, with books, documentaries, and films exploring the psychological and social dimensions of the story. While some of these portrayals were criticized for sensationalizing the events, others were praised for shedding light on important issues and fostering empathy for survivors. The case became a touchstone for discussions about the complexities of trauma, the power dynamics of abuse, and the need for systemic change. Advocacy and survivor empowerment. One of the most significant outcomes of the case was the empowerment of survivors and the growth of advocacy movements. The survivors of David Carter's crimes, despite their initial reluctance to speak publicly, eventually became powerful voices for change. They worked with advocacy organizations to raise awareness about human trafficking, psychological abuse, and the long-term effects of captivity. Their courage in sharing their stories inspired other survivors to come forward and seek help, breaking the silence that often surrounds such experiences. The case also led to the establishment of new organizations and initiatives dedicated to supporting survivors of abuse and exploitation. These groups provided resources such as counseling, legal assistance, and job training, helping survivors rebuild their lives and regain their independence. The survivors' advocacy efforts also contributed to a broader cultural shift, challenging stereotypes about victims and emphasizing the importance of listening to and believing survivors. A legacy of awareness and change. The social impact of the David Carter case cannot be overstated. It was a tragedy that exposed the darkest corners of human behavior, but also a story of resilience, justice, and the potential for change. The case forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about abuse, exploitation, and the systems that allow such crimes to occur. It inspired reforms in law enforcement, public policy, and community awareness, creating a legacy of vigilance and advocacy. Most importantly, the case highlighted the strength of the human spirit and the importance of compassion and support for those who have endured unimaginable suffering. The survivor's journey from captivity to freedom, from silence to empowerment, serves as a powerful reminder that even in the face of darkness there is hope for healing and justice. Their courage and resilience continue to inspire change, ensuring that their voices and the lessons of their story will not be forgotten. Lessons learned. The case of David Carter and the horrors of his underground bunker left an indelible mark on society, not only because of the unimaginable suffering endured by the victims, but also because of the profound lessons it taught about human behavior, systemic failures, and the resilience of the human spirit. This case forced individuals, communities, and institutions to confront uncomfortable truths about the vulnerabilities in our social systems, the complexities of trauma, and the need for vigilance and compassion. The lessons learned from this tragedy extend far beyond the courtroom, offering insights into how we can better protect the vulnerable, support survivors, and prevent such atrocities from happening again. The importance of community vigilance. One of the most glaring lessons from the case was the critical role that community awareness and vigilance play in preventing and addressing abuse. David Carter operated his underground bunker for years in a suburban neighborhood, surrounded by people who went about their daily lives unaware of the horrors taking place just beneath their feet. While some neighbors later reported hearing strange noises or noticing unusual activity around Carter's property, these observations were dismissed as insignificant or left unreported. This lack of action highlighted a broader societal tendency to avoid getting involved in situations that seem suspicious but do not directly affect us. The case underscored the importance of trusting one's instincts and taking action when something feels wrong. It reminded people that reporting suspicious behavior, no matter how minor it may seem, can save lives. Law enforcement agencies and advocacy groups have since launched public awareness campaigns to educate communities about the signs of abuse, exploitation, and human trafficking. These campaigns emphasize that everyone has a role to play in protecting the vulnerable, and that speaking up can make a difference. The complexity of trauma and psychological manipulation. The psychological impact of David Carter's crimes on his victims revealed the profound and often misunderstood nature of trauma. The survivors exhibited a range of emotional and psychological responses, including symptoms of PTSD, anxiety, depression, and Stockholm Syndrome. The presence of Stockholm Syndrome in particular sparked widespread confusion and debate, as some of the victims expressed sympathy for Carter and described moments of perceived kindness during their captivity. This phenomenon highlighted the ways in which abusers manipulate their victims, creating a cycle of hope and despair that fosters dependency and complicates the victim's ability to recognize the full extent of their abuse. This case served as a powerful reminder that trauma is not a one-size-fits-all experience. Each survivor processes their ordeal differently, shaped by their unique circumstances, coping mechanisms, and psychological resilience. It also emphasized the need for greater public understanding of trauma and the importance of providing survivors with compassionate, non-judgmental support. The case inspired mental health professionals to develop new approaches to trauma-informed care, ensuring that survivors receive the specialized treatment they need to heal and rebuild their lives. The need for stronger systems of protection. The case exposed significant gaps in the systems designed to protect vulnerable individuals, particularly women, and those working in high-risk industries. Many of Carter's victims were lured into captivity through manipulation and deceit, exploiting their vulnerabilities and lack of support networks. This highlighted the need for stronger safety nets and resources for at-risk populations, including access to education, employment opportunities, and mental health services. In response to the case, policymakers and advocacy groups called for reforms to improve the identification and protection of potential victims. These efforts included increased funding for shelters and support services, the implementation of training programs for law enforcement and social workers, and the development of early intervention strategies to identify individuals at risk of exploitation. The case also underscored the importance of addressing the root causes of vulnerability, such as poverty, lack of education, and social isolation, to prevent individuals from falling prey to predators like Carter. The role of technology in crime and prevention. David Carter's use of technology to facilitate his crimes, including the production and distribution of illicit content, highlighted the dark side of the digital age. The case revealed how predators exploit online platforms and encrypted networks to carry out their activities, often evading detection for years. This raised urgent questions about the responsibility of technology companies to monitor and prevent the misuse of their platforms, as well as the need for law enforcement to develop more sophisticated tools for investigating online criminal activity. At the same time, the case demonstrated the potential of technology as a tool for prevention and justice. Investigators used digital forensics to trace Carter's financial transactions, recover surveillance footage, and identify individuals involved in his network. These efforts underscored the importance of investing in advanced technologies and training for law enforcement to stay ahead of increasingly sophisticated criminals. The case also inspired the development of new tools and initiatives to detect and disrupt online exploitation, ensuring that technology is used to protect, rather than harm, vulnerable individuals. The power of survivor advocacy. One of the most inspiring lessons from the case was the strength and resilience of the survivors, who refused to let their experiences define them. Despite the unimaginable trauma they endured, the survivors found the courage to share their stories, advocate for change, and support others who had experienced similar abuse. Their voices became a powerful force for raising awareness about human trafficking, psychological manipulation, and the long-term effects of captivity. The survivors' advocacy efforts highlighted the importance of listening to and believing survivors, as well as providing them with the resources and platforms they need to heal and make their voices heard. Their courage inspired others to come forward, breaking the silence that often surrounds abuse and creating a sense of solidarity among survivors. The case also demonstrated the transformative power of survivor-led initiatives, which have become a driving force for change in the fight against exploitation and abuse. The need for compassion and empathy. Perhaps the most profound lesson from the case was the importance of compassion and empathy in responding to trauma and supporting survivors. The public's initial reaction to the survivors' expressions of sympathy for Carter revealed a lack of understanding about the complexities of abuse and the psychological toll it takes on victims. This judgmental attitude only added to the survivors' emotional burden, highlighting the need for greater education about trauma and the importance of approaching survivors with kindness and understanding. The case reminded society that healing is a long and difficult process, and that survivors need time, space, and support to rebuild their lives. It also emphasized the importance of creating a culture that prioritizes empathy and compassion, both for survivors and for those working to prevent and address abuse. By fostering a deeper understanding of trauma and its effects, society can create an environment where survivors feel safe, supported, and empowered to heal. A call to action. The case of David Carter was a tragedy that exposed the darkest corners of human behavior, but it also served as a call to action for individuals, communities, and institutions. It reminded society of the importance of vigilance, the need for systemic change, and the power of resilience and advocacy. The lessons learned from this case continue to shape public policy, inspire activism, and drive efforts to create a safer and more compassionate world. Ultimately, the case taught us that while we cannot undo the past, we can honor the survivors' courage by working to prevent future tragedies, supporting those who have endured trauma, and striving to build a society where such horrors are no longer possible. It is a reminder that even in the face of darkness, there is hope for healing, justice, and change, and that each of us has a role to play in making that hope a reality.